It was the response no one expected, the words that stopped Clarence Thomas cold, in a chamber built on centuries of pomp and tradition. Silence fell like a thunderclap. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. With precision sharper than any gavel, she delivered a single line that sliced through the air and left the room in stunned disbelief. The cameras caught it. The audience gasped. Even Thomas himself, a man accustomed to years of power and insulation, shifted uncomfortably, as if the foundations beneath him had cracked. This wasn't just another exchange, another routine sparring match in Washington. No, this was the kind of moment that crystallizes in history, replayed endlessly on screens across the country. For one instant, the balance of power tilted. A younger congresswoman from Texas stood toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful figures in America's judiciary. She made him flinch. Her words weren't just a retort. They were a declaration, a lightning strike that illuminated the hypocrisy of a man shielded for too long by silence. It was a moment charged with more than politics. It carried the electricity of justice, denied in truth demanding to be heard. And in that instant, Crockett wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every voice told to stay quiet, every citizen made to feel invisible, while the powerful enjoyed their unchecked privileges. The audience watching from home knew immediately. This wasn't about clever debating points. It was about courage, about whether truth still had the strength to rattle those who had built their empires on secrecy. Clarence Thomas had faced criticism before, but rarely had he been confronted so directly, so fearlessly, by someone who embodied everything he could not dismiss: youth, authenticity, and the audacity to challenge him without hesitation. The moment replayed in slow motion across timelines and news feeds, amplified by hashtags that spread like wildfire. But in the hearing room itself, there was only that breathless silence, hanging heavy and unforgettable. Crockett had turned a hearing into a stage, a retort into a reckoning, and yet this wasn't the whole story. To grasp why her words carried such devastating force, to understand why this single exchange made Clarence Thomas falter in ways he never had before, we must look deeper. But to truly understand why this moment shattered the silence, we need to step back. To understand the full weight of Jasmine Crockett's response, you have to understand the storm swirling around Clarence Thomas long before that moment. For years, whispers had grown into headlines, and headlines had exploded into national outrage. Each revelation peeled back another layer of privilege and secrecy, revealing a justice who seemed less like a servant of the Constitution and more like a beneficiary of billionaires. It started with questions about luxury vacations, undisclosed, extravagant, the kind of getaways few Americans could ever dream of. Flights on private jets, stays at lavish resorts, yacht trips where champagne flowed, and deals were whispered in shadowed corners. All courtesy of wealthy benefactors with interests before the very court Thomas was sworn to protect with impartiality. The public had been told judges must live above reproach, yet here was a justice indulging in perks that would have sent any lower-ranking official into scandal or resignation. Every revelation struck a nerve. Headlines screamed about corruption. Editorials demanded accountability. Protesters gathered outside courthouses holding signs that read, "No one is above the law." But inside the Supreme Court, Thomas remained silent. He offered no transparency, no contrition, only the steady, stubborn stillness of a man who believed the storm could never truly touch him. This is where Jasmine Crockett's voice became so powerful. Because Crockett doesn't come from that world of untouchable privilege. She rose through the grind of public service, defending those who couldn't afford the lawyers and loopholes that shield the elite. She represents the new face of progressive leadership, unafraid, unpolished in the best way, unwilling to let corruption be cloaked in tradition. And in that hearing room, her words carried not just her own convictions, but the outrage of millions who had watched Thomas glide past accountability for far too long. The stakes were more than personal. They were generational. What happens when those entrusted with the highest responsibilities treat their office as a personal entitlement? What does it say about democracy when judges live like kings while everyday citizens struggle for housing, healthcare, and dignity? These were the questions hovering over that chamber. Questions no gavel could silence. Crockett's confrontation mattered because it pierced through the illusion of untouchability. For years, people had wondered who would have the courage to say what everyone else was thinking. That day, it was her. And her response didn't just land in that room. It reverberated across the country, reminding people that silence could be broken, that power could be challenged. The timing was everything. America was already restless, already questioning whether its institutions still worked for the people. Trust in the Supreme Court had plunged to historic lows. Young voters, immigrants, and communities of color were watching closely, measuring whether democracy could still deliver fairness in the face of entrenched corruption. And Crockett, They saw not just a representative, but a mirror of their own frustrations and hopes. And this is why her words hit harder than any headline. Because they weren't abstract, they weren't wrapped in legal jargon or polite hesitation. They were raw, honest, defiant, the kind of truth that cuts through spin and forces even the most powerful to squirm. The confrontation was more than an exchange. It was a crack in the facade, a reminder that even the highest bench in the land isn't immune from accountability. And what happens next doesn't just change the hearing room, it ripples across the entire nation. For decades, Clarence Thomas has carried himself like a man untouchable. The quiet presence on the bench, the steady vote on the most divisive issues, the figure who rarely spoke, but whose silence carried weight. To his defenders, he was stoic. To his critics, he was stonewalled, immune to scrutiny. But behind that mask of stillness, a story was unfolding. One of contradictions, privilege, power, sustained not by principle, but by protection. It begins with the very seat he occupies. When Thomas was nominated to the Supreme Court, controversy erupted almost immediately. The hearings became infamous, not because of his jurisprudence, but because of accusations of impropriety that electrified the nation. Anita Hill's testimony, detailed, courageous, unforgettable, forced Americans to confront questions of character and integrity at the highest levels of power. Even as Thomas denied it all, the scars of that moment never faded. His confirmation left the public divided, and yet he prevailed. The message was clear: power shields its own. From that day forward, Thomas embraced silence as strategy. On the bench, he became known for asking few questions, offering little to the public, guarding himself within walls of discretion. But those walls also concealed the very lifestyle that would later come to define his controversies. The reports began to trickle out: lavish vacations, undisclosed gifts, relationships with billionaires whose fortunes were tied to political outcomes. Each revelation struck like a match in dry grass, sparking outrage that spread across the public sphere. Private jet flights to exclusive retreats, stays at luxury resorts where decisions of power were whispered between clinking glasses, yachts cruising through turquoise waters where the company of oligarchs and magnates replaced the company of the people. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns of indulgence, built into the very fabric of his career. And the most damning part: these weren't small oversights. They were undisclosed, hidden from public record, shielded from the very transparency that justices are expected to uphold. Ethics experts sounded alarms. Watchdog groups demanded accountability. Even members of Congress pressed for answers. But Thomas remained as he had always been: silent, still, untouchable. For everyday Americans, the contrast was staggering. Families struggling to pay for groceries or save for college watched as one of the most powerful men in the nation enjoyed luxuries without consequence. Workers who labored long hours to make ends meet saw a justice accepting perks they could never dream of. Perks that seemed to come with invisible strings attached. How could a man tasked with interpreting the Constitution fairly and impartially live so comfortably at the mercy of billionaires? The picture was becoming clear. Thomas wasn't detached because of his temperament. He was detached because his life had been lifted far above the realities of those he was sworn to serve. His decisions impacted millions, yet his day-to-day existence insulated him from their struggles. He didn't hear their voices. He didn't walk their roads. He was carried by privilege, funded by those who saw him not as a guardian of justice, but as an investment. The nation took notice. Poll after poll showed faith in the Supreme Court plummeting, and Thomas's name was never far from the discussion. He became a symbol not just of one man's choices, but of an entire institution seen as corrupted by money, arrogance, and a lack of accountability. And still, he did not break his silence. He carried on as though above reproach, protected by allies, by tradition, by the inertia of an institution unwilling to confront its own shadows. Each time outrage built, each time the public demanded answers, Thomas's fortress of secrecy only seemed to thicken. But no fortress lasts forever. The truth has a way of finding cracks, and voices have a way of rising when the silence grows too heavy. Clarence Thomas built his career on the assumption that no one could touch him, that no one could pierce the armor of his position, his silence, his power. But while Thomas built walls of secrecy, a new voice was rising, armed with truth and fearlessness. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's words struck with such devastating precision, you must first understand the road that led her there. A road so different from Clarence Thomas's. Marble-lined halls of privilege that their eventual collision felt almost inevitable. Jasmine Crockett's story does not begin with inherited connections or gilded opportunity. It begins with grit. Raised in a world where obstacles were daily realities, She carved her own path through resilience and relentless determination. While others with ambition for politics might have sought the safety of elite firms or cushioned academic chairs, Crockett went straight to the front lines. She became a public defender in cramped offices and overburdened courtrooms. Crockett met face-to-face with the forgotten, men and women who had no safety net, no resources, and often no one else willing to fight for them. She saw how the scales of justice tilted, how those with wealth and influence could bend outcomes, while those without often faced a system designed to crush them. And rather than accept this imbalance as inevitable, she dug in her heels. She fought case after case, often against overwhelming odds, wielding the law not as a privilege but as a shield for the vulnerable. Her style was unmistakable, fearless, outspoken, unapologetically direct. She was the lawyer who wouldn't be silenced by intimidation, the advocate who wouldn't soften her words to make the powerful comfortable. For every courtroom where she stood alone against prosecutors with deeper pockets and thicker files, Crockett's voice carried the weight of those who had been told they didn't matter. She wasn't just defending clients, she was defending dignity itself. That spirit carried her into politics, where she refused to play the game by the old rules. In the Texas House of Representatives, Crockett quickly became known as the woman who would not back down. When voter suppression bills threatened the very foundation of democracy, she stood defiantly on the floor, challenging colleagues who tried to strip away rights from communities of color. When powerful lobbies pushed their agendas, she answered with the same unflinching candor that had marked her courtroom days. Her speeches weren't tailored for elites. They were spoken for the people who rarely had a microphone, immigrant families fighting for stability, workers stretched thin between jobs, young activists demanding a future free from systemic inequality. Crockett's authenticity resonated because it was real. She didn't craft an image. She lived her truth openly, sometimes bluntly, and always without apology. It was that raw honesty that propelled her to Congress, where her voice grew even louder. While others hedged their words for the sake of bipartisanship or career preservation, Crockett leaned into the urgency of the times. She confronted hypocrisy head-on, whether it came from across the aisle or from within the establishment itself. And she did it not for headlines or sound bites, but because she believed silence in the face of injustice was complicity. Her rise represented something bigger than one woman's ambition. It was symbolic of a generational shift, a new wave of leaders unafraid to say what millions were thinking, afraid to look the most entrenched figures of power in the eye and call out their contradictions. Where Clarence Thomas embodied insulation and secrecy, Crockett embodied transparency and fire. Where he spent years shielded by billionaires and tradition, she built her reputation in the trenches, one case, one battle, one speech at a time. For her supporters, Crockett became more than a politician. She became proof that the marginalized could not only survive the system, but confront it, change it, and redefine it. Every fiery exchange, every fearless remark reminded people who felt ignored that they had a champion. In her words, they heard their own frustrations. In her victories, they saw their own resilience reflected. It's this authenticity, this unshakable commitment to truth, that made her confrontation with Clarence Thomas so explosive. Because when someone who has lived the struggles of ordinary people comes face to face with someone who has lived in the comfort of unaccountable privilege, the collision cannot be casual. It must be volcanic. Crockett didn't just step into that hearing room with a prepared line. She stepped in, carrying the weight of her journey, the voices of the silenced, and the conviction that corruption and arrogance could not be allowed to stand unchallenged. Every word she spoke was sharpened by the battles she had fought, by the sacrifices she had made, and by the unwavering belief that the law should serve people, not protect the powerful. And so, when her voice finally cut through the chamber and forced Clarence Thomas into silence, it wasn't just a political moment. It was the culmination of two stories running on parallel tracks, one of secrecy, privilege, and insulation, and the other of courage, authenticity, and truth. And it was only a matter of time before these two worlds collided in front of millions. The hearing room was thick with anticipation, though few admitted it aloud. It wasn't just another oversight meeting or routine grilling of officials. This was the arena where reputations clashed, where legacies could unravel under the hot glare of cameras. Every seat was filled, every pen poised, every lens trained on the dais. The gravity was unmistakable, because sitting before the committee was Clarence Thomas, a man whose name had become synonymous with controversy and silence, and facing him was Jasmine Crockett, whose fire had made her impossible to ignore. At first the exchanges were measured. Crockett's questions were crisp, her tone steady, her eyes locked on Thomas with the piercing focus of someone who had prepared not just for hours, but for a lifetime of moments like this. She began by laying the groundwork, asking about disclosures, about ethics, about the kinds of obligations that every public servant, no matter how lofty, is supposed to honor. Thomas responded with the same practiced detachment he had carried for decades. Short answers. Evasions disguised as restraint. His silence had always been his armor, and he leaned on it now, hoping her momentum might dull against the stone wall of his reserve. But Crockett didn't waver. If anything, each half-answer only fueled her resolve. She pressed again, sharper this time, her words cutting past the pretense of civility and digging into the heart of the matter. Why should the American people believe in justice when those entrusted with it refused to hold themselves accountable? The question lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable. Thomas shifted slightly, his composure intact but his eyes betraying the faintest flicker of irritation. This wasn't the deference he was used to. This wasn't the cautious respect that so many had shown him over the years. Fearful of confronting a sitting Supreme Court justice too directly, Crockett wasn't playing by those rules. She wasn't interested in politeness for its own sake. She was interested in truth. The room began to sense it. The aides stopped scribbling notes. The murmurs in the gallery faded. Every camera zoomed tighter, capturing the clash that was escalating moment by moment. It was no longer a sterile exchange of words. It was a duel between two worldviews, one shielded by secrecy, the other armed with raw honesty. Thomas tried again to brush her off, offering vague platitudes about procedure, about tradition, about matters better left to the court. But Crockett's eyes narrowed, and her voice, steady but unrelenting, sliced through the excuses. With all due respect, Justice Thomas, tradition doesn't excuse corruption. Procedure doesn't excuse secrecy. And silence doesn't excuse the truth. The chamber went still. That line wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic in tone. It was calm, surgical, and that made it all the more devastating. Thomas leaned back in his chair, small defensive motion, as though distance might shield him from the weight of her words. But there was no escaping. Crockett had locked him into a narrative he couldn't control. He could no longer hide behind silence. The silence itself was becoming his indictment. For viewers at home, the moment was electric. Social media timelines erupted in real time, clips spreading before the hearing even adjourned. But inside the room, all that existed was the thick tension between two figures embodying opposite ends of America's political soul, the insulated justice, and the fearless challenger. The escalation had reached its peak. Crockett had drawn blood, not through anger, but through composure, and everyone watching could sense that the decisive blow was near. The tension wasn't about if she would strike, but when. And then she struck. There are moments in politics when the air itself seems to hold its breath. The hearing room, packed with journalists, staffers, and the hum of live cameras, had already grown heavy with tension. But when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, steady and unshaken, it was clear that what came next would be remembered long after the microphones were cut. Her voice was calm, almost quiet at first. That was the brilliance of it. She didn't raise her tone, didn't bark or grandstand. She spoke with the certainty of someone who had lived the truth she was about to unleash. Justice Thomas, she began, her eyes never leaving his. You've built a career in silence, but silence can't cover the truth. And the truth is this: you've enjoyed luxury gifts, secret vacations, and the comfort of billionaire friends, while Americans struggle to put food on the table. You call it tradition. I call it corruption. The words landed like a hammer. A ripple of reaction moved through the chamber, a stifled gasp here, a sharp intake of breath there. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer, capturing the flash in Crockett's eyes as she paused. Letting the accusation hang in the air, Thomas shifted, his lips tightening. He reached for the shield he had always relied on: silence. But silence, in this moment, sounded louder than any denial could have. It was the silence of guilt. It's the silence of a man who had no convincing answer. Crockett pressed on, each sentence sharp and deliberate, each pause another twist of the blade. You sit on the highest court in the land, a court meant to embody fairness and integrity. Yet you accepted yacht trips from men with cases that benefited from your decisions. You failed to disclose flights that most Americans couldn't even dream of affording. You've turned justice into a private club for the rich. The audience at home exploded. On Twitter, hashtags like hashtag Crockett vs. Thomas and hashtag Mic Drop Justice shot into trending territory. TikTok flooded with clips of her precise delivery. Memes were born within minutes. Crockett's calm stare against Thomas's faltering composure. Side-by-side captions reading truth versus silence. Inside the hearing room, the spectacle was even more visceral. Aides exchanged glances. A journalist whispered to another, scribbling furiously. The oxygen in the chamber seemed thin as Crockett delivered the indictment that many had longed to hear, but few had dared to voice. And here's the question. Justice Thomas, she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. When you enjoy those private jets, when you sip champagne on a billionaire's yacht, do you ever think about the single mother who can't afford rent? Do you think about the student drowning in loans, or the veteran fighting through red tape for basic health care? Because the decisions you make don't fall on your billionaire friends. They fall on the very people you've ignored. The words hit harder than any shouted condemnation ever could. They framed the confrontation not as politics, but as morality. It was the raw contrast between a man living in opulence and a people scraping by in scarcity. The audience at home, progressive and weary of corruption, felt seen in Crockett's questions. Their frustrations were finally voiced in the halls of power. Thomas opened his mouth, as though to speak, but the words never came. The cameras caught the hesitation, the uncertainty, the faltering of a man unaccustomed to being cornered so precisely. He cleared his throat. He looked down, and in that silence, Crockett's argument grew even louder. She continued, her composure unshaken. You've defended your actions by saying these gifts didn't influence your decisions. But the truth, Justice Thomas, is that influence doesn't have to be proven in receipts. Influence lives in perception. And the American people now see a court that looks less like justice and more like a playground for the wealthy. That is your legacy, whether you admit it or not. Again, she paused. The pause was surgical. Viewers leaned closer to their screens, waiting for his response, but none came. He sat frozen, the weight of her words pressing down with every second of his silence. The internet was already ablaze. Instagram Reels looped the moment with captions like she said what we've all been thinking. On Reddit, threads flooded with comments. This is history in the making. Finally, someone holding him accountable. Crockett is the real voice of the people. Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned in, her tone growing sharper but never rising. For years, you've hidden behind your silence, behind the prestige of your office, believing it would protect you. But silence isn't dignity. It's cowardice. And corruption, no matter how quietly it hides, will always be louder than the truth. And today, the truth is louder than you. Gasps rippled through the room. Even the committee chair shifted in his seat. Visibly rattled by the magnitude of her words, Thomas tried once more to respond, fumbling through a vague remark about procedure and precedent, but the damage was done. His words stumbled, unconvincing, drowned out by the echo of Crockett's counterattack. He wasn't just being questioned. He was being unmasked. The clash had transcended politics. It had become symbolic, a showdown between privilege and accountability, between arrogance and courage. Every sentence Crockett spoke was a mirror held up to a nation exhausted by corruption, a nation desperate for proof that truth could still cut through the noise as she delivered her final blow. Her voice sharpened to a point. Justice isn't measured by the vacations you take or the company you keep. Justice is measured by whether you serve the people who trusted you with power. And on that measure, Justice Thomas, you have failed. The silence that followed was seismic. No denial, no rebuttal. Only the faint shuffle of papers and the worry of cameras capturing the downfall of a man who once seemed invincible. For Jasmine Crockett, it was more than a victory in a hearing room. It was a mic-drop moment, a line in history drawn by courage and truth. And for Clarence Thomas, it was an unraveling, his silence now deafening. His composure cracked for the world to see. But the battle wasn't over. What followed next shook the entire political landscape. The instant Jasmine Crockett's words left her lips, the chamber wasn't the only place that erupted. Outside those walls, across phones, televisions, and timelines, America was already reacting. Within minutes, clips of the exchange flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. The moment spread like wildfire, not in slow motion, but in a torrent of shares, duets, remixes, and memes. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Crockett vs. Thomas. Hashtag Mic Drop Justice. Hashtag Truth Over Silence. The internet did what it does best. It amplified. Side-by-side edits showed Crockett's piercing stare next to Thomas's awkward silence. With captions like "This is what accountability looks like," TikTok creators synced her words to music, turning her calm dismantling of Thomas into anthem-like edits that looped endlessly on For You pages. Even on platforms often divided by ideology, the reaction was strikingly one-sided. People weren't just impressed, they felt vindicated. Talk shows jumped on the story. That very night, late-night comedy hosts played the clip to roaring audience laughter, dissecting Thomas's stammering silence with punchlines that wrote themselves. One joked, "For a man who's made a career out of saying nothing." It's amazing how loud that silence was when Crockett finished. Laughter rolled through studio audiences. But underneath the humor, the deeper message was unmistakable. Power had been challenged, and it had flinched. Cable news panels the next day were electric with debate. Progressive commentators hailed Crockett as the voice of a new generation, someone unafraid to speak truth to power. Even centrist analysts admitted the optics were devastating for Thomas. The headlines told the story. Crockett delivers knockout. Thomas stumbles under fire. One line shakes the court. But it wasn't just pundits. Celebrities, athletes, and cultural icons chimed in. A Grammy-winning artist tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett just spoke for all of us." A well-known actor posted the clip with the caption, "When courage walks into the room, corruption can't hide." On Instagram, activists shared Crockett's words layered over powerful imagery of protests, marches, and ordinary people demanding justice. Her response had become more than a moment. It was a movement. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to breaking it down. Progressive shows celebrated her bravery, while political strategists analyzed the ripple effects. What did this mean for the court's already plummeting reputation? Would it energize young voters? Could it shift the narrative of accountability in Washington? One host concluded, this wasn't just Crockett silencing Thomas. This was Crockett reminding Americans that power without integrity is fragile. For everyday viewers, the emotional impact was even deeper. People who had grown cynical about politics felt a surge of hope. On Reddit threads, immigrants, workers, students, and veterans shared their personal stories of feeling ignored by institutions, and how Crockett's words made them feel heard, if only for a moment. One commenter wrote, "She didn't just roast him, she represented us. She said what my family has wanted to scream for years." Another added, "Watching Thomas squirm reminded me that the fight isn't hopeless. We just need more leaders like her." The moment became water cooler conversation, classroom debate fodder, dinner table reflection. Parents showed their kids the clip, telling them, this is what standing up for what's right looks like. Teachers used it as a springboard to discuss civic responsibility. It wasn't just about one savage line anymore. It was about dignity triumphing over arrogance, truth over silence. Yet in all the memes, hashtags, and viral edits, something deeper stirred beneath the surface. Because while Crockett's takedown made for incredible television in internet gold, it also laid bare a larger crisis, the erosion of trust in the very institutions meant to safeguard democracy. If one justice could be so easily unmasked, what did that say about the system itself? If silence had shielded corruption this long, how much else lay hidden in plain sight? The laughter, the applause, the viral celebration, they were cathartic, but they were also fleeting. The confrontation had opened a wound far bigger than one man's hypocrisy. It revealed the fragility of public faith, the hunger for accountability, and the urgent need for voices willing to risk everything to speak the truth. And so, as the internet laughed and applauded, as Crockett's face became a symbol of fearless resistance, the story didn't end. It was only just beginning. Yet, beneath the memes and sound bites, a deeper truth was waiting to be uncovered. When the noise faded, and the hashtags began to cool, and the late-night jokes gave way to tomorrow's headlines, what remained was something more enduring than a viral moment. Jasmine Crockett's exchange with Clarence Thomas became more than a clip. It became a mirror, a reflection of who we are, who we want to be, and what kind of country we believe justice should serve. Because at its core, this wasn't about a congresswoman against a justice. It wasn't just about a savage response or a mic drop moment. It was about the timeless clash between integrity and privilege, between the arrogance of unchecked power and the courage of truth spoken plainly. And in that clash, America saw something it desperately needed, proof that dignity could still rise above corruption. Crockett reframed the exchange not as personal triumph, but as a moral stand. "This isn't about me," she told a crowd days later. "This is about the people who deserve a court that sees them, hears them, and serves them. This is about reminding every young person, every immigrant, every family struggling to be heard, that their truth is powerful enough to silence even the mightiest voices of corruption." Her words resonated because they spoke to something universal. Every community knows what it feels like to be dismissed by the powerful. Every working family understands what it means to struggle while elites indulge without consequence. And every person yearning for fairness knows that silence, while painful, is never permanent, because one voice spoken at the right moment can shatter it. The lesson was larger than Clarence Thomas, larger even than the court. It was about America itself, a democracy only as strong as the integrity of those who defend it. Crockett reminded us that titles and robes do not guarantee justice. People do. And when those people fail, it is the responsibility of others, often younger, often underestimated, to rise and restore what has been lost. For viewers, the inspiration wasn't just admiration for Crockett's courage. It was a challenge, a call to see themselves as part of the same moral equation, to understand that every act of speaking up, whether in a courtroom, a classroom, a workplace, or a family gathering, carries the same spark that Crockett carried into that hearing. Truth, when spoken without fear, has the power to silence lies that once seemed unshakable. Cinematic moments like these live on because they remind us of possibility. The possibility that courage still exists in politics. The possibility that truth can still rattle the walls of power. The possibility that even in a time of cynicism, authenticity can break through. Crockett's exchange didn't erase corruption, but it proved that corruption is not invincible. And that's the heart of the lesson. Integrity doesn't need privilege to win. Dignity doesn't need yachts, jets, or billionaires to make its case. All it needs is a voice, steady and unafraid. Crockett had that voice, and through her, millions found theirs too, as the nation reflected. People realized this wasn't just a hearing to watch, it was a stand to join. It was a reminder that democracy isn't a spectator sport, and that when one person dares to speak the truth, it opens the door for countless others to do the same. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Clarence Thomas will be remembered not just for the silence that followed, but for the truth that created it. And in that silence, America heard something profound, the sound of arrogance cracking, the sound of accountability demanding to be answered, the sound of justice, however fragile, insisting on its place in the light. And for those watching, for those who saw themselves in Crockett's courage, the lesson was clear. The battle wasn't just about two figures in a room. It was about all of us, about the fight for fairness that belongs to every generation, and it's a fight that continues. And so we return to the moment that started it all. Jasmine Crockett silencing Clarence Thomas with one savage response. It wasn't just words exchanged in a hearing room. It was history condensed into a single flash of courage, a reminder that even the most insulated power can stumble when faced with fearless truth. Thomas, cloaked in privilege and silence for decades, found himself stripped bare, not by anger, but by clarity. And Crockett, carrying the weight of her community, her convictions, and her country, proved that arrogance can be silenced, not with shouting, not with chaos, but with dignity. That's why this matters. Because if one voice, one question, one perfectly timed response can pierce the armor of corruption, imagine what millions of voices can do together. This isn't just about Crockett versus Thomas. This is about you, about us, about the fight for fairness that belongs to every American who refuses to let corruption define our future. So here's the call. If you believe in dignity over deceit, if you believe in truth over silence, then don't let this moment stop here. Subscribe to this channel, share this story, and amplify the voices that fight for integrity in the halls of power. Be part of this movement, because movements only grow when people like you carry them forward. This is more than politics. This is about identity, justice, and the courage to speak when silence has lasted too long. Jasmine Crockett showed us what that courage looks like, and we'll leave you with this, because when truth speaks, silence is the only answer corruption has left.